The first gunshot rang across the horizon as Lillian Nichols ducked behind the weathered barrel, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fort Worth, Texas wasn't supposed to be her final destination, but after 5 days of hard riding with barely any rest, her mare couldn't take another mile. It was 1879, and the Texas summer heat pressed down on the dusty streets with unforgiving intensity. Lillian clutched her small leather satchel, all that remained of her former life, and tried to quiet her ragged breathing. The shootout taking place in the street had nothing to do with her, but experience had taught her that trouble had a way of finding her regardless. "You knew in town, miss." The voice startled her. Lillian turned to see a tall man with kind eyes looking down at her. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and a light-colored Stetson sat atop his head. There was no judgment in his gaze, not yet anyway. "Just passing through," she answered cautiously, tucking a strand of copper hair behind her ear. "Or at least I was hoping to. Dangerous time to be passing through." He offered his hand. "Darren Yates. I run the livery stable on the edge of town." Lillian hesitated before taking his hand. "Lillian Nichols." "Well, Miss Nichols, that gunfight's between the Halloran brothers, and they'll be at it till one of them can't stand. Your horse looks about ready to collapse. Might I suggest you wait it out at Mrs. Finnegan's boarding house? It's just down the way, and she keeps a clean place." Lillian's eyes narrowed. "Why would you help a stranger?" Darren shrugged, his broad shoulders rising and falling beneath his simple cotton shirt. "Fort Worth sees all kinds passing through. Some stay, some don't. But nobody should have to sleep in the street because the Halloran boys can't settle their differences like civilized folk." Against her better judgment, Lillian followed him to the boarding house. Mrs. Finnegan was a round woman with a permanent smile etched into deep creases around her mouth. She took one look at Lillian's dusty traveling clothes and ushered her inside without question. "Room's 50 cents a night, includes breakfast," the older woman said. "Dinner's extra but worth every penny." Lillian counted out the coins from her dwindling funds. "Just 2 nights, Mrs." Finnegan nodded. "Darren, be a dear and fetch the lady's things from her horse." "I don't have much," Lillian interjected. "Just this." She held up her satchel. "Then you'll help me bring her horse round to the stable, won't you?" Mrs. Finnegan directed at Darren, who tipped his hat in agreement. That first night in Fort Worth, Lillian slept better than she had in weeks. Maybe it was the clean sheets or the absence of danger at her heels, but for once, she didn't dream of flames or accusations or the look in Edward's eyes when they hanged him. By morning, her resolve to move on had weakened. Her mare needed rest, and truth be told, so did she. 2 days stretched into a week as she took odd jobs around town to earn enough for supplies for the journey ahead. It was at the general store that she first felt the weight of suspicious gazes. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Davenport, had been friendly enough until Lillian mentioned she'd come from Silverton, Colorado. "Silverton?" Mrs. Davenport's tone chilled. "That's where they had that terrible business with the mining company, isn't it? The explosion and all those deaths." Lillian's hand froze over the bolt of fabric she'd been examining. "Yes, madam. Terrible shame. All those men dead because of one man's greed." Mrs. Davenport's eyes narrowed. "What brings you all the way to Fort Worth from there?" "A fresh start," Lillian answered simply, but she could see the questions forming behind the woman's eyes. By nightfall, whispers had begun to circulate. Lillian had seen it before the way news traveled in small communities, each retelling embellishing the facts until truth was barely recognizable. She considered packing up and leaving, but her funds were still too low, and her horse had developed a limp that Darren was treating at his stable. "Don't mind the gossip," Darren told her when she came to check on her mare the next day. "Folks around here just don't have enough to occupy their minds." It's not gossip if it's true, Lillian said quietly, stroking her horse's neck. I was engaged to Edward Blackburn. He was the one who caused the explosion. Darren's eyes widened slightly, but to his credit, he didn't step away from her. That doesn't make you responsible. Try telling that to the widows of Silverton. Lillian's voice caught. 26 men died in that mine. Edward was trying to blast a new tunnel to reach a gold vein he'd discovered, but he used too much dynamite. The whole shaft collapsed. Darren watched her face carefully. And they blamed you too. I stood by him at first. I couldn't believe he would be so reckless. Lillian's eyes welled with tears she refused to let fall. But then they found his journal. He knew the risk. He wrote that it was worth it, that the gold would make us rich beyond our dreams. He was willing to gamble with those men's lives. But you didn't know. It didn't matter. I was Edward Blackburn's woman. When they hanged him, half the town thought I should hang beside him. Lillian's voice hardened. The other half just wanted me gone, so I left. Darren was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your horse will need at least another week before she's fit to travel." Longer if you're planning to go far, Lillian sighed. I can't afford to stay that long. I could use help around the stable. Nothing fancy, just feeding, grooming, maybe helping with the books. I've never been much good with numbers. She studied him, searching for ulterior motives in his face, but finding only earnest concern. Why would you want to help me? Because everyone deserves a second chance, Miss Nichols, even those who didn't do anything wrong in the first place. So Lillian began working at Darren's livery stable. The work was hard but honest, and she found comfort in the routine and the animals' uncomplicated companionship. Darren was fair and kept a respectful distance, though she occasionally caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Word of her past spread through Fort Worth like wildfire. Within days, she felt the change, the averted gazes, the sudden silence when she entered the mercantile, the way mothers pulled their children closer when she passed on the street. "Murderer's woman," she overheard one man mutter to another outside the saloon. "Blood money," whispered a woman at church, though Lillian had arrived in town with barely enough to feed herself. Darren seemed oblivious to the town's growing hostility, or perhaps he chose to ignore it. He continued to treat her with the same steady kindness, teaching her about horses and sharing stories of his travels across the frontier. "You've seen a lot of the country," Lillian remarked one evening as they closed up the stable. "Enough to know there's always another horizon worth seeing." Darren secured the last stall. "But Fort Worth has been good to me. Came here 6 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and enough money for one good meal. Worked for old man Jenkins until he passed, then took over the stable. The town accepted you easily," Darren chuckled. "Wouldn't say that. Took time. People here are cautious with newcomers, but they come around once they see you're willing to put in honest work. Unless you have a past," Lillian said quietly. Darren's expression softened. "Everyone has a past, Miss Nichols. Some just cast longer shadows than others." As the days passed, those shadows grew darker. Mrs. Finnegan reluctantly informed Lillian that she could no longer stay at the boarding house other guests had complained. She explained apologetically. The only room Lillian could find was a cramped attic space above the laundry, where the heat was stifling and the smell of lye soap permeated everything. The general store began to mysteriously run out of items whenever she came to shop. The baker's fresh bread was always spoken for by the time she arrived. Even the church minister suggested she might find more suitable worship in the next town over. Only at Darren's stable did she find refuge from the town's judgment. He seemed genuinely untroubled by her association with Edward Blackburn, more interested in who she was than who she had once loved. "You ever going to tell me where you're headed?" he asked one afternoon as they worked side by side, mucking out stalls. Lillian paused, leaning on her shovel. I don't know. West, I suppose. California, maybe. Long journey for a woman alone. I've managed so far, Darren nodded. That you have. But there's no shame in putting down roots somewhere, starting fresh. Is that what you're doing here, starting fresh? Something flickered across his face, a memory or a regret. In a manner of speaking. Before she could question him further, the stable door banged open. Sheriff Matthews stood there, his weathered face grim beneath his mustache. Mr. Yates, he nodded to Darren, then turned cold eyes to Lillian. Miss Nichols, I've had some complaints about you. Lillian straightened her spine. What complaints would those be, Sheriff? Folks are uncomfortable with your presence in town given your associations in Silverton. I've broken no laws. No, madam, you haven't, but this town has a right to decide who's welcome and who isn't. Darren stepped forward. She works for me, Sheriff. She's been nothing but hard-working and honest since she arrived. That may be, but sentiment's running high. Widow Jenkins says her husband wouldn't have died if men like Miss Nichols' fiancé hadn't been so greedy. Got folks riled up. Thomas Jenkins died of pneumonia, Darren said flatly. Point is, people are drawing connections, making comparisons. The sheriff adjusted his belt. I'm not here to run you out of town, Miss Nichols. Just delivering a friendly warning that you might find life easier somewhere else. After he left, Lillian's hands trembled so badly she had to set down the shovel. I should go, she said. This was always temporary. Don't let them drive you away, Darren said, his voice low and intense. That's what they want. What I want is peace, Mr. Yates. I haven't had it since Edward died. And you think you'll find it running from town to town? Lillian had no answer for that. That night, a rock shattered the window of her rented room. A note wrapped around it read simply, "Murderer's whore." The next morning, Lillian found her mare's mane crudely cut and the word leave carved into her saddle. This has gone too far, Darren fumed when he saw the damage. I'm going to the sheriff. It won't help, Lillian said tiredly. Sheriff Matthews made his position clear. Then I'll talk to Reverend Collins. He can reason with his congregation. The Reverend suggested I find another church. Lillian began gathering her few possessions. My horse is well enough now. I'll be gone by morning. Darren caught her arm. At least stay until the weekend. Give me time to change some minds. Why do you care so much whether I stay or go? His eyes held hers steadily. Because I know what it's like to be judged for someone else's crimes. The words hung between them, laden with unspoken history. Before Lillian could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by the arrival of a customer needing his horse shod. That evening, Lillian packed her belongings and settled her account with the laundry owner. She would leave at first light before most of the town was awake. Better to slip away quietly than risk further escalation. But when she returned to the livery before dawn to collect her horse, she found Darren already there, saddling his own mount. What are you doing? She asked. Coming with you, at least as far as the next town. He tightened a cinch with practiced hands. These parts can be dangerous for a lone traveler. I don't need an escort, Mr. Yates. Maybe not. But I'd never forgive myself if something happened to you because this town drove you out alone. Lillian shook her head. You have a business here, a life. The stable will keep until I return. He smiled faintly. Besides, Jesse knows how to run things. He's been working for me long enough. Why would you risk your standing in this community for a woman you barely know? Darren's expression grew serious. Because 10 years ago I was where you are now, blamed for something I didn't do, driven from a town I'd started to call home. Before Lillian could respond, the stable door opened. A small group of men entered, led by Howard Jenkins. the son of the late stable owner. Thought we might find you here, Howard said, his voice hard. Planning to sneak away before facing what you've done. I've done nothing wrong, Lillian said quietly. Women like you bring nothing but trouble. Howard spat on the ground. Your kind think you can just show up anywhere, trailing your sins behind you like a shadow. Darren moved to stand between Lillian and the men. That's enough, Howard. Miss Nichols is leaving peacefully just as you wanted. Not good enough, Howard growled. She needs to understand what happens to people who bring death and destruction wherever they go. One of the men brandished a coil of rope. Maybe she needs a reminder of what happened to her murderous lover. Fear shot through Lillian like ice water. These men weren't just here to frighten her, they meant actual harm. This isn't justice, Darren said, his voice steady despite the danger. This is a lynch mob, plain and simple. Step aside, Yates, Howard commanded. This isn't your concern. Any threat to someone under my protection is my concern. Darren's hand moved to rest on the pistol at his hip. I don't want trouble, but I won't let you harm Miss Nichols. The tension in the stable was thick enough to cut with a knife. Howard's eyes darted between Darren's face and his holstered weapon. You draw on old friends for this woman? Howard asked incredulously. You know what her fiancé did. 26 men dead for gold. And she didn't plant the dynamite or light the fuse, Darren replied evenly. Now I'm asking you all, as neighbors and as men who claim to respect the law, to walk away. For a moment, it seemed the confrontation might turn violent. Then the stable door opened again, and Sheriff Matthews entered, followed by 2 deputies. What's going on here? The sheriff demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew. Just having a conversation, Howard muttered. Sheriff Matthews surveyed the scene, the packed horses, Lillian's fearful stance, the rope in one man's hands. Looks like more than talk to me. He turned to Lillian. You leaving town, Miss Nichols? Yes, Sheriff. At first light, the sheriff nodded slowly. Then these gentlemen will wish you a safe journey and be on their way. He stared pointedly at Howard and his companions. Won't you boys? Reluctantly, the men filed out, Howard pausing at the door to glare at Darren. You're making a mistake, Yates. After they left, the sheriff turned to Darren. You sure about this? Town has a long memory. I'm sure, Darren said firmly. Sheriff Matthews sighed. I'll have one of my deputies ride with you to the county line, just to be safe. He tipped his hat to Lillian. No offense, Miss Nichols, but I'll sleep easier knowing you're someone else's concern. When they were alone again, Lillian's legs nearly gave out from the released tension. I didn't ask you to risk your reputation for me. Some things are worth risking, Darren replied simply. We'll leave in an hour. Best to have daylight on our side. True to his word, a deputy accompanied them for the first few miles out of Fort Worth. The man was taciturn but professional, keeping a watchful eye on the trail behind them. When they reached the county line, he tipped his hat and turned back. Lillian and Darren continued westward, following the trail toward Weatherford. They rode mostly in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The Texas landscape stretched around them, vast and indifferent to human troubles. You said you'd been in my position before, Lillian finally said as they stopped to water the horses at a small creek. What happened? Darren was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I was a deputy in a small town near Abilene, younger then, full of ideas about justice. He stared into the distance. The sheriff I served under was taking bribes from cattle rustlers. When I found out and confronted him, he framed me for theft. Did you go to trial? Never got the chance. Town turned on me overnight. Sheriff made sure everyone believed I was the corrupt one. Darren's jaw tightened at the memory. Night before I was to be locked up, the sheriff's brother and some friends came to deliver their own brand of justice. I managed to escape, but not before they left their mark." He unconsciously touched his left side, and Lillian realized he was referring to a physical scar. "You were innocent," she said. "Yes, but it didn't matter. Once people decide who you are, they stop seeing anything else." Darren looked at her directly. "That's why I couldn't stand by and watch it happen to you." They made camp that night beneath a stand of cottonwoods. As Darren built a small fire, Lillian unpacked the provisions they'd brought from Fort Worth. "Where will you go after Weatherford?" he asked. Lillian shrugged. "Wherever seems promising. I have some skills I can sew, keep books, teach children their letters." "And what about what you want? Not just to survive, but to live?" The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her desires rather than her past. "I want peace," she said finally. "A place where I'm not Edward Blackburn's woman, but just Lillian Nichols." "You deserve that," Darren said softly. They reached Weatherford the next day around noon. The town was smaller than Fort Worth, but bustling with activity. Darren knew of a respectable boarding house where Lillian could stay, and he arranged for stabling of their horses. "You should be safe here," he told her as they stood outside the boarding house. "No one knows your history." "Until someone from Fort Worth passes through," Lillian said with a resigned smile. "It's only a matter of time." "Then make the most of the time you have." Darren hesitated. "I should head back tomorrow." Lillian felt an unexpected pang at his words. "Of course. You have your business to attend to." "I could stay a few days. Make sure you're settled." She shook her head. "I've already cost you enough goodwill in Fort Worth. I won't be responsible for keeping you from your livelihood too." That evening, they dined at the hotel restaurant, both acutely aware that their brief alliance was coming to an end. Darren told stories of his travels across the frontier, and Lillian found herself laughing for what felt like the first time in years. "You're different when you smile," Darren observed. "Lighter somehow." Lillian felt her cheeks warm. "I haven't had much cause for smiling lately. Then I'm glad I could provide the occasion." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Darren prepared to leave, checking his horse's tack and securing his provisions. "Thank you," Lillian said as they stood outside the stables. "Not just for the escort, but for believing in me when no one else would." Darren took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "If you ever need anything at all, you can find me in Fort Worth. Even though associating with me has cost you the town's good opinion, some opinions matter more than others." His eyes held hers. "Safe travels, Lillian Nichols." She watched him ride away, a strange emptiness settling in her chest. Then she turned toward the boarding house, ready to begin again in Weatherford. For 3 weeks, Lillian settled into a quiet routine in her new town. She found work at a dressmaker's shop, where her nimble fingers and eye for detail quickly made her valuable to the owner, Mrs. Tillman. The widow was kind but not overly curious about Lillian's past, which suited her perfectly. Lillian rented a small room above the shop and took her meals at a nearby cafe. Slowly, cautiously, she began to hope that perhaps Weatherford could be more than just another temporary stop. Then one afternoon, a familiar face appeared in the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Davenport from Fort Worth, accompanying her sister who lived in Weatherford. Recognition flashed in the woman's eyes. "Why, it's you, the woman who was engaged to that murderer from the Colorado mine disaster." The shop fell silent. Mrs. Tillman looked between Lillian and Mrs. Davenport in confusion. "I don't know what you mean," Lillian said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Don't play innocent with me," Mrs. Davenport huffed. "You're Edward Blackburn's woman, the one who fled Fort Worth rather than face justice." "There was no justice to face," Lillian replied. "I committed no crime, but the damage was done." By evening, whispers had begun to circulate through Weatherford. The next morning, Mrs. Tillman reluctantly asked Lillian to find other employment, just until things settled down, she explained apologetically. Within days, Lillian found herself in the same position she'd been in Fort Worth. The boarding house owner asked her to leave. The cafe owner suggested she take her meals elsewhere. People crossed the street to avoid walking past her. History was repeating itself with cruel efficiency. Lillian packed her meager possessions once more, wondering if this would be her fate forever to be driven from town to town, perpetually marked by Edward's crimes. She was preparing to leave when the stagecoach brought unexpected news. A fire had broken out in Fort Worth, destroying several buildings, including Darren's livery stable. 3 horses had died in the blaze, and Darren himself had been injured trying to save them. Lillian read the newspaper account with growing horror. Without thinking twice, she paid for passage on the next stagecoach back to Fort Worth. The town looked much the same as when she'd left it, except for the blackened ruins where Darren's stable had stood. She made her way to the doctor's office, heart in her throat. "Doctor." Patterson was surprised to see her. "Miss Nichols, didn't expect you back in these parts. I heard about Mr. Yates. How badly is he hurt? Burns on his arms and shoulders, smoke in his lungs. He'll recover, but it'll take time." The doctor studied her face. "He's staying at the Peterson place, just outside town. Their son worked at the stable, and they offered to take him in during his recovery." Lillian thanked him and set out for the Peterson farm. She was acutely aware of the stares that followed her through town, but for once, she didn't care what people thought. All that mattered was seeing with her own eyes that Darren would be all right. The Peterson farm was modest but well kept. Mrs. Peterson answered Lillian's knock, her expression immediately wary. "I know who you are," the woman said bluntly. "What do you want?" "I heard about Mr. Yates. I've come to see him." Mrs. Peterson's lips thinned. "He's resting, please," Lillian said softly. "I just need to know he's going to recover." Something in her tone must have reached the older woman, because after a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside. "He's in the back room. Don't tire him out." Darren lay on a narrow bed, his arms wrapped in bandages. His face was pale, with dark smudges beneath his eyes that spoke of pain and exhaustion. When he saw Lillian in the doorway, surprise flashed across his features. "Lillian, what are you doing here?" She moved to his bedside, fighting the urge to take his hand. "I heard about the fire." "I had to come. You shouldn't have." His voice was hoarse from smoke inhalation. "It's not safe for you here. I don't care." Lillian sat in the chair beside the bed. "What happened?" Darren closed his eyes briefly. "Fire started in the hayloft. Spread so fast there wasn't time to get all the horses out." Pain crossed his face, not physical pain, she realized, but grief for the animals he couldn't save. "I'm so sorry. Everything's gone. The stable, the tack, the feed store next door." He looked at her, his eyes haunted. "Jesse didn't make it out. He was sleeping in the loft." Lillian's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Darren, I'm so sorry. Some folks are saying it wasn't an accident." A chill ran down Lillian's spine. "What do you mean?" "Howard Jenkins was in the saloon that night, talking loud about how I'd chosen the wrong side, how I'd regret standing up for a murderer's woman." "You think he started the fire?" Lillian's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know. Sheriff's investigating, but—" Darren's expression was grim. "Howard's father was well respected in this town. People are more inclined to believe it was just a tragedy, not arson." "Because of me," Lillian said, the realization settling like a stone in her stomach. "Because you helped me." "Don't," Darren said firmly, despite his weakened state. "This isn't your fault, isn't it? If I hadn't come to Fort Worth, then I never would have met you." Darren's eyes held hers. "And that would have been the greater tragedy." Lillian stayed by his side until Mrs. Peterson gently suggested she let him rest. She found lodging at the same laundry where she'd stayed before, ignoring the proprietor's reluctance. This time, she wasn't running away. Over the next several days, Lillian split her time between caring for Darren and investigating the fire. She spoke to anyone who would talk to her: the blacksmith whose shop was across from the stable, the barmaid who had served Howard that night, even Jessica's grieving widow. What she learned confirmed her worst fears. Howard had been heard threatening Darren, had been seen near the stable shortly before the fire was discovered, and had mysteriously left town the morning after the blaze. Lillian took her evidence to Sheriff Matthews, who listened with increasing concern. "This is circumstantial," he said when she finished. "Not enough to convict a man, but enough to look into it," Lillian pressed. "Jesse died in that fire. Darren nearly did too." The sheriff studied her thoughtfully. "You care about him, Yates. He was the only person in this town who saw me as more than Edward Blackburn's woman, the only one who gave me a chance. And now you're giving him one." Sheriff Matthews sighed. "I'll send telegrams, try to locate Howard. If what you say is true, he needs to answer for it." As Darren slowly recovered, Lillian became his constant companion. She read to him when his eyes were too tired to focus on print, helped change his bandages, and brought news from town. The Petersons, initially wary of her, gradually warmed to her presence as they saw her devotion to Darren's care. "You don't have to stay," Darren told her one afternoon as they sat on the Petersons' porch. "I know what it costs you to be in Fort Worth." "I'm not leaving until you're well," Lillian replied firmly. "After that, well, we'll see." Darren studied her face. "What changed?" "When you left, you were determined to keep moving west." Lillian considered the question. "When I heard you were hurt, nothing else mattered. Not my safety, not my plans, not even my fear of this town's judgment. I just needed to know you were all right. Because you felt responsible." "At first, perhaps." She met his gaze steadily. "But now I stay because I want to. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like I'm running anymore." Something shifted in Darren's expression, a softening, a dawning hope. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Matthews. "Miss Nichols, Mr. Yates." The sheriff removed his hat. "Got news. Found Howard Jenkins in Dallas. He was carrying a fair bit of cash, more than he should have had." When confronted, he admitted to being paid to start the fire. Darren sat up straighter, wincing at the movement. "Paid? By whom?" "Man named George Harmon." "Mean anything to you?" Darren's face paled. "Harmon was the sheriff I worked for in Abilene, the corrupt one." Sheriff Matthews nodded grimly. "Seems he's been tracking you for years. Got word of your whereabouts and decided it was time for revenge." "So it wasn't because of me," Lillian breathed. "It wasn't because Darren helped me leave town." "No, madam. Appears this was a much older grudge." The sheriff replaced his hat. "Howard's being brought back to stand trial for arson and Jessica's death. Harmon too, if we can find him." After he left, Darren sat in stunned silence. "All these years," he finally said, "I thought I'd left that part of my life behind." Lillian took his hand, careful of his healing burns. "The past has a way of following us, doesn't it?" "Yes." Darren's fingers tightened around hers. "But maybe that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes the past brings understanding. Sometimes it brings us exactly where we need to be." As news of Howard's arrest and confession spread through Fort Worth, attitudes toward Lillian began to shift. The realization that she had been instrumental in solving the crime caused many to reconsider their judgment of her. Not everyone changed their minds, of course, but enough that she could walk down the street without facing open hostility. Darren's recovery was slow but steady. By late summer, he was well enough to begin thinking about rebuilding his business. Several townspeople, feeling guilty about their treatment of both Darren and Lillian, offered to help with the construction of a new livery stable. "Would be a shame to lose the best horseman in the county," old Mr. Turner said gruffly when he came to offer lumber from his mill. "Town needs you, Yates." As plans for rebuilding took shape, Lillian faced a decision. Darren no longer needed her care, and with his reputation in Fort Worth restored, there was no reason for her to remain except for the feelings that had grown between them, still unspoken but increasingly difficult to ignore. "What will you do now?" Darren asked one evening as they walked along the creek that ran behind the Peterson farm. His strength had returned enough that he could manage short walks, though his left arm remained stiff from the healing burns. "I've been offered a position at the schoolhouse," Lillian said. "It seems my assistance with the investigation has convinced some that I might be trustworthy after all. Will you accept it?" she shrugged. "I haven't decided. It would mean staying in Fort Worth." Darren stopped walking, turning to face her. "And is that something you want, to stay?" "That depends," Lillian said carefully, "on whether I have a reason to." "What if I gave you one?" Darren took both her hands in his. "Lillian, these past months have shown me what kind of woman you are: brave, loyal, resilient. I admire you more than I can say." Lillian's heart quickened. "Darren, let me finish," he said gently. "I know what it's like to be judged for someone else's actions. I know the weight of carrying a past you didn't choose. But I also know that the future is what we make it, together or apart. Are you asking me to stay for you?" "I'm asking if you would consider building something new here, with me." His eyes held hers, vulnerable and hopeful. "I can't promise it will be easy. There will always be those who remember Edward Blackburn when they look at you. But I see Lillian Nichols, only Lillian, and I would be honored if you would allow me to court you properly." Joy blossomed in Lillian's chest, fragile but undeniable. "I would like that very much." The rebuilding of the livery stable became a community effort. Men who had once crossed the street to avoid Lillian now tipped their hats when they saw her bringing lunch to the workers. Women who had whispered behind her back invited her to join their sewing circle. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was progress. Through it all, Darren's courtship was steady and respectful. He brought her wildflowers from his rides into the countryside, escorted her to church on Sundays, and introduced her to the simple pleasures of life in Fort Worth: the Harvest Festival, the county fair, evening concerts in the town square. Their romance blossomed slowly, built on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding that had formed during their shared trials. Lillian found herself smiling more, laughing freely, looking toward the future instead of constantly glancing over her shoulder at the past. By Christmas, Darren's new stable was completed, larger and sturdier than the original, with a small office where Lillian helped keep the books. Their business partnership complemented their personal relationship, each bringing different strengths to their shared work. On Christmas Eve, Darren asked Lillian to accompany him on an evening ride. He was mysterious about their destination, insisting only that she bundle up against the winter chill. He led her to a small parcel of land just outside town, where a modest cabin stood among a grove of oak trees. A lantern hung from the porch, casting a warm glow in the gathering dusk. "Whose place is this?" Lillian asked, admiring the neat construction. "It could be ours," Darren said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. "If you want it to be." Lillian turned to him in surprise. "Ours. I've been saving to buy land for years. When this property came available, it seemed perfect, close enough to town for convenience, far enough for privacy." Darren took her hand. "I had the cabin built these past months. That's where I've been disappearing to on my days off." Speechless, Lillian allowed him to lead her up the porch steps. The lantern's light revealed a small but beautifully crafted home, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and two doors that presumably led to bedrooms. "It's lovely," she whispered. "There's something written on the lantern," Darren said softly. Lillian looked closer and saw a single word etched into the metal: "Welcome." Tears sprang to her eyes as Darren knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "Lillian Nichols, I know what it means to be unwelcome, to be judged and found wanting based on assumptions rather than truth. I promise that with me, you will always be welcomed, always be valued for exactly who you are." His voice trembled slightly. "Will you marry me and make this house our home?" "Yes," Lillian answered without hesitation. "Yes, Darren, I will." They were married in the spring of 1880 in a small ceremony at the church in Fort Worth. Not everyone from town attended. Some wounds healed slower than others, but those who came did so with genuine goodwill. The Petersons were there, as was Sheriff Matthews, Mrs. Finnegan, and even Dr. Patterson, who had tended Darren's burns. Jessia's widow came too, having forgiven Lillian for her indirect role in the tragedy and grateful for her persistence in bringing Howard Jenkins to justice. After the ceremony, Darren hung the lantern with its simple welcome message beside their front door, a symbol of their promise to create a home where judgment was suspended and grace was freely given. Life settled into a rhythm. The stable prospered under their joint management. Lillian taught part-time at the school, finding fulfillment in helping children learn to read and write. Together, they built a life characterized by hard work, mutual respect, and deepening love. In the summer of 1881, Lillian discovered she was expecting their first child. Darren's joy was boundless. He spent weeks crafting a cradle from oak timber, lined with the softest flannel Lillian could find. Their son, Samuel, was born in the winter, bringing new light to the darkest season. He had his father's steady gaze and his mother's copper hair, a perfect blend of them both. As the years passed, Fort Worth grew and changed. The railroad brought new prosperity and new faces to town. Old prejudices faded as newer, more pressing concerns took precedence. Lillian and Darren's story became just one of many in the tapestry of the community, remarkable only for how ordinary it had become. They added to their family a daughter, Grace, joined them 2 years after Samuel, followed by another son, Thomas, 3 years later. Their home expanded along with their family, with Darren adding rooms as needed, always with the same care he'd put into the original construction. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Lillian reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Darren. "Standing up for me when the town turned against me, you nearly lost everything." Darren's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I gained everything that matters: a partner, a family, a home filled with love." He kissed her temple. "No, I have no regrets." "Nor do I," Lillian said, leaning into his embrace. "Though sometimes I wonder what became of Edward. Not the man they hanged, but the man I thought I knew before the accident, the one who talked about building a future together." "You built that future," Darren said gently, "just not with him." In 1885, an unexpected letter arrived from Silverton. It was from the widow of one of the miners who had died in the explosion, a woman named Margaret Collins. She wrote that she had followed Lillian's story through newspaper accounts and mutual acquaintances. "I hated you for years," the letter read. "Blamed you almost as much as I blamed Edward Blackburn. But time brings perspective, and I've come to understand that you were as much a victim of his recklessness as my husband was, albeit in a different way. I write now to offer forgiveness, though perhaps you never sought it, and to ask forgiveness in return for the hatred I carried." The letter brought tears to Lillian's eyes, not from reopened wounds, but from the healing balm of understanding. She wrote back, sharing her life in Fort Worth, her family, her happiness despite the difficult path that had led to it. A correspondence developed between the two women, bridging the gap between their different but connected losses. Eventually, Margaret visited Fort Worth, staying with Lillian and Darren for a week. The two women walked together through town, their friendship a visible symbol of reconciliation that touched even the most hardened hearts in the community. By the 1890s, Lillian and Darren were established pillars of Fort Worth society. Their children were growing: Samuel apprenticing at the stable, Grace showing a talent for teaching like her mother, young Thomas still deciding his path, but showing interest in law, inspired by Sheriff Matthew's stories. The town had long since forgotten to judge Lillian for her past. She was now Mrs. Yates, the schoolteacher with the generous spirit, the stable owner's wife who remembered everyone's name and always had a kind word to offer. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Darren surprised Lillian by refurbishing the lantern he'd hung on their porch the day he proposed. The metal had tarnished over the years, the etched welcome nearly worn away by weather and time. "I thought about replacing it," he told her as they stood arm in arm, admiring his handiwork. "But then I realized its imperfections tell our story. How something weathered and tested can still shine with the right care. Like us," Lillian said softly, "exactly like us." Darren turned to face her, his hands gently framing her face. 20 years had left their mark on both of them, silver threading their hair, lines etched around their eyes, but the love between them had only deepened with time. "When I hung this lantern and etched that word, I wanted you to know you would always have a place where you belonged," Darren said. "I had no idea then what we would build together, how rich our life would become." Lillian leaned into his touch. "When I arrived in Fort Worth, I was just looking for somewhere to rest before moving on. I never imagined I'd find a home, a family, a place to truly belong." "The town shunned you for your past love," Darren acknowledged. "But I hung a lantern at your door that said welcome, and look what grew from that simple act of faith." "Love," Lillian answered simply. "Love grew." In the golden light of evening, surrounded by the home they had built together, Darren and Lillian Yates stood as testimony to the power of second chances, the possibility of redemption, and the transformative nature of being truly seen for who you are rather than the shadows that follow you. The lantern glowed, a beacon in the gathering dusk, welcoming them home once more.